You know, ever since I was little, I always wanted to be Cruella de Vil, and now I am.
20 years ago, I knew that transgenders was gonna be a thing. Earliest I had seen that word transgender was Baphomet, the transgender.
Like, now we live in a country where a man could say, now I'm a woman. Now I'm a woman. And we will call you by your name as a woman. But that doesn't mean that a doctor ain't gonna call you until you need a prostate examination.
Katt Williams and D.L. Hughley have suddenly found themselves pulled into the online storm surrounding Magic Johnson's child, E.J., and the reaction has been anything but quiet. After E.J. was seen in Paris wearing a dramatic leather dress and towering heels, clips began spreading fast, turning one fashion moment into a full-blown debate about identity, fame, image, and how far public performance can go before people start asking harder questions.
I don't attract gay men, and I'm not attracted to gay men. These are not the men that are interested in me in that capacity. I do that when I go to the straight rooms.
But the deeper tension isn't just about an outfit, it's about the way Hollywood turns personal expression into spectacle, then lets the internet argue over the pieces. EJ's past comments about beauty, attraction, and labels only added more fuel because every statement seemed to raise another question instead of closing the conversation. And that's where things started to feel less like celebrity gossip and more like a cultural mirror nobody really wanted to look into. DL approached it from a blunt, old-school perspective, arguing that self-definition has limits when it collides with basic reality, while Katt Williams appeared to see something larger, stranger, and far more unsettling beneath the surface.
But even I told them on my birthday in June that I was like, we're not doing he, we're not doing man, we're not doing gay. And it was very freeing. You know, even like son, I was like, you know, the world tried to give me that label, like Magic Johnson's son. And I was like, well, he's dead. And now there is Miss Thing. Like, we're not doing that either.
On Joe Rogan's podcast, Katt suggested that Hollywood has long blurred identity, power, and ritual symbolism in ways the public rarely examines closely. Whether people agree with him or not, his comments shifted the conversation from EJ's fashion choices to a much darker question. Why does the entertainment industry keep turning private identity into public theater? And once that question enters the room, the silence around it becomes almost as revealing as the outrage itself. What Katt Williams described next didn't sound like a joke anymore. It felt like he was tracing a pattern he believed had been hiding in plain sight for years. According to Katt Williams, these so-called rituals weren't symbolic gestures but tests of loyalty, moments where individuals were expected to prove just how far they were willing to go to stay inside the system. He referenced imagery like kissing the ring, framing it not as tradition, but as a quiet submission to something higher up the chain, something rarely named but always felt.
Like, now we live in a country where a man could say, now I'm a woman. Now I'm a woman. And we will call you by your name as a woman. But that doesn't mean that a doctor ain't gonna call you until you need a prostate examination. You can wear a sundress when you go. Yeah. You're still getting the same thing I'm getting. So happy anniversary, I guess. You can say you're a thing and you're that. Yeah. You like it, and you have to like. For now, I'm a white man trapped in this black man's body. Yeah. My name is Chad. Yeah. Now that ain't gonna work good for the police. Wait, I'm a white man, but both of y'all get out. But the first. Yeah.
And here's where the narrative takes an even stranger turn, because Katt suggested he saw this shift coming long before it became a mainstream conversation, almost as if the cultural moment unfolding now had been set in motion years earlier. But if that's true, then why does it feel like it's accelerating now instead of slowly unfolding? As the conversation on Joe Rogan's platform continued, Katt leaned into a darker interpretation, one where public figures aren't just entertainers, but participants in a system that tests, reshapes, and ultimately controls them. In his view, Moments that appear expressive or bold on the surface could carry a second meaning beneath, something designed to chip away at identity until compliance becomes second nature.
20 years ago, I knew that transgenders was going to be a thing. It wasn't because I was a prophet. It's just I had gotten so much information that I understood that things are secular. So I understood that the earliest I had seen that word transgender was Baphomet, the transgender. And so I knew that in the ritual of Baphomet, the transgender, to show allegiance to him, you had to kiss his ring.
Really?
And it said both of those things. So I knew that both of those things would become popular in the future.
And just when that idea starts to sound too extreme to take seriously, another layer quietly settles in. What if the real mechanism isn't force, but gradual normalization? He pointed out how certain patterns seem to repeat: unusual fashion choices, symbolic imagery, public contradictions, raising the possibility that none of it is as spontaneous as it appears. Then comes the thought that lingers a little longer than expected: if influence like this exists at the top, why wouldn't it extend outward to those closest to it? And once that question lands, it reframes everything, because suddenly it's not just about celebrities anymore, it's about the environment surrounding them and who grows up inside it without ever questioning the rules. The story takes on a different weight when the spotlight shifts from the industry to the family itself.
20 years ago, I knew that transgenders was going to be a thing. It wasn't because I was a prophet. It's just I had gotten so much information that I understood that things are secular. So I understood that the earliest I had seen that word transgender was Baphomet, the transgender. And so I knew that in the ritual of Baphomet, the transgender, to show allegiance to him, you had to kiss his ring.
Really?
And it said both of those things. So I knew that both of those things would become popular in the future.
Because suddenly the questions feel far more personal than performative. For some high-profile figures, especially those built on images of strength, discipline, and traditional masculinity, the contrast can feel jarring to outside observers, even if the public response remains polished and supportive. And that's where Magic Johnson becomes a focal point in these conversations, not because of anything he's explicitly said, but because of how closely people study what he doesn't say. Known for his charisma, business success, and larger-than-life presence on and off the court, Magic has long represented a certain ideal, which is why his visible support for E.J. Johnson often gets analyzed frame by frame. But here's where the tone subtly shifts, because while interviews show him expressing acceptance, some viewers claim his delivery feels slightly off, pointing to pauses, phrasing, or fleeting expressions that they interpret in their own way. That interpretation, of course, exists entirely in the eye of the audience, yet it continues to circulate because it feeds into a broader narrative people are already trying to piece together. In several interviews, Magic has referred to EJ using more familiar labels, while EJ himself has publicly distanced from those same definitions, creating a quiet disconnect that invites speculation without ever confirming anything concrete. And just when it seems like a simple difference in wording, the conversation deepens, because now it's not just about identity, but about whether public support always reflects private emotion. Some believe Magic's reactions reveal discomfort, others see a father navigating a complex situation with care, and that divide keeps the discussion alive.
When my son came out, I was so happy for him and happy for us as parents. And we love him. And EJ is amazing. And so you gotta support your child. In the Black community, young gay men or young ladies who are lesbian, they're afraid to tell their parents. Just like I want my son EJ to talk to me about everything. I want my son Andre to talk to me, my daughter Elisa, and that's what it's about. Yes, I go to church. You know, I'm a Christian. But at the same time, you know, this is reality. You know, my son is gay, that's reality.
But the more this gets dissected, the more it raises a question that doesn't have an easy answer. When the world is watching every expression, how much of what we're seeing is real, and how much of it is shaped by the pressure to appear a certain way? As the narrative tightens, the focus shifts back to a quieter but more complicated pressure, one that isn't spoken aloud, yet seems to shape every public moment. For Magic Johnson, image has never been a small detail. It's been the foundation of everything he rebuilt after his career took an unexpected turn in the early 1990s. Over time, he transformed himself into something larger than an athlete, a symbol of resilience, business success, and public trust. And that kind of reputation doesn't just exist, it has to be constantly maintained, which is why some observers believe there's more at stake in his responses than simple acceptance or disagreement, because even a slight deviation from that carefully balanced image could ripple outward in ways that affect partnerships, public perception, and legacy. But here's where the tension quietly deepens, because when maintaining that image becomes essential, it raises the possibility that authenticity and expectation might not always align.
Your youngest son chose to live his life as a gay man.
That's right. I don't care. You want to be a gay man? I'm supporting that.
Right.
I'm supporting that. I'm supporting you.
Then the story pulls in another layer, one rooted in cultural timing rather than personal choice. During Magic's years in the NBA, alongside figures like Larry Bird and Charles Barkley, the environment was shaped by a very different set of norms, ones that don't neatly match the expectations placed on public figures today. By the time E.J. Johnson stepped into the spotlight, those expectations had shifted dramatically, creating a situation where any response would be interpreted, dissected, and potentially criticized.
How old is your daughter now?
My child's 23.
Okay.
24 now.
Okay.
And this was happening when they were 22, 23. And for me, like,
that's the let go time. That's like you're your own person now.
Yeah. But
And-
you're trying to hold on, right? And you want this thing that's in your head, normalcy, and you think about your grandchildren,
Yeah.
and you all kinds of shit. And it's like, yo, it's not on me to think about none of that.
And just when it seems like a simple matter of adapting to the times, another question begins to surface. Is adaptation always genuine, or can it sometimes be strategic? That uncertainty is what keeps people watching closely, reading into gestures, searching for meaning in moments that might otherwise pass unnoticed. And then, almost inevitably, the conversation circles back to Katt Williams and his broader theory, one that frames all of this not as coincidence, but as part of a larger system of pressure and performance. Within that perspective, public displays of support, carefully timed appearances, and even celebratory moments could be interpreted as something more complex, depending on who's watching. It's a viewpoint that some dismiss entirely, and others can't quite shake, especially when they start connecting patterns across different stories. But the most unsettling part isn't the claim itself, it's the shift in perspective it creates. Because if you follow that line of thinking, even briefly, the roles begin to blur in a way that's hard to ignore, leaving behind a final question that lingers longer than expected. In a world built on visibility, who is actually in control of the image and who is quietly shaped by it? And just when it feels like the narrative has settled into a clear direction, another possibility quietly slips in, one that reframes everything without announcing itself. What if the entire situation isn't about control or hidden systems at all, but about how public perception distorts anything that doesn't fit neatly into expectation? Because when someone like E.J. Johnson steps outside traditional boundaries, the reaction doesn't just reflect him, it reveals the discomfort, curiosity, and assumptions of millions watching from a distance.
The trans conversation is not the entire conversation with us. This is 10% of our relationship. Right. We have conversation about anything.
Yeah.
Chicken fingers, French fries, like.
Remember our conversation on mustard?
Yeah, mustard. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I don't want people to think that every time that Zaya and I sit down and have, this daddy-daughter time, and I tell you guys all the time, I always create moments with my village, for my people, right? Especially my kids. I'm gonna find these moments to create with them.
And that's where things become harder to untangle. Because now, every gesture, every interview, every glance from Magic Johnson gets filtered through narratives that may or may not exist in reality. But here's the unsettling twist. What if the audience, not the industry, is the one unconsciously shaping the pressure? At the same time, the influence of voices like Katt Williams continues to echo in the background, not necessarily because people fully believe them, but because they introduce just enough doubt to make everything feel less certain. His perspective plants a question that lingers beneath the surface. Are we witnessing something orchestrated or simply reacting to something we don't fully understand yet? And the more that question circulates, the more it feeds a cycle where speculation becomes part of the story itself. But just when it seems like you can separate fact from interpretation, another contradiction appears. Because in a world driven by attention, even genuine moments can start to look staged. And that's the detail that refuses to settle, leaving behind a final thought that's difficult to shake. Maybe the real mystery isn't what's happening behind the scenes, but why everyone feels so compelled to explain it at all. What makes this even more difficult to pin down is how quickly the narrative seems to rewrite itself depending on who's watching and what they already believe. One moment, it's framed as personal expression. The next, it's interpreted as symbolism. And somewhere in between, it becomes something almost theatrical, like a performance no one can quite agree on the meaning of. And that's where the tension quietly builds, because when a story keeps shifting like that, it stops being about facts and starts becoming about interpretation. With figures like E.J. Johnson and Magic Johnson at the center, every public appearance feels less like a moment and more like a piece of a puzzle people are determined to solve, even if the full picture doesn't actually exist. But here's the detail that complicates everything. What if there was never a single hidden explanation to begin with? At the same time, the influence of commentary from voices like Katt Williams continues to ripple through the conversation, not as definitive proof, but as a catalyst that keeps curiosity alive. His ideas don't close the case, they open more doors, each leading to a different version of what might be happening beneath the surface. And just when one explanation starts to feel convincing, another perspective challenges it, creating a loop where certainty is always just out of reach. But that uncertainty might be the most revealing part of all, because it suggests that the real story isn't something hidden, it's something constantly being constructed in real time. And as that realization settles in, it leaves behind a lingering question that's harder to ignore than any theory. If everyone is interpreting the same moment so differently, what does that say about the story? And what does it say about us? By the time you step back and look at the full picture, the dynamic starts to feel less like a single story and more like a pattern people are trying to decode in real time. On one side, you have E.J. Johnson living boldly in the spotlight, unapologetic, highly visible, and undeniably part of a new cultural wave that rewards individuality. On the other, there's Magic Johnson, a figure whose identity was built in a completely different era, now navigating that shift under constant public scrutiny. And here's where the tension subtly sharpens, because to some observers, it doesn't look like conflict. It looks like contrast that hasn't fully settled yet. But just when that interpretation starts to feel convincing, another layer emerges. What if that perceived tension says more about generational change than anything hidden beneath it? Then the lens widens, pulling in other familiar names that seem to echo similar conversations. Marlon Wayans has spoken publicly about his child, balancing humor with honesty in ways that some interpret as processing in real time, while Eddie Murphy has remained more private, choosing what to share and what to keep out of the spotlight entirely. Meanwhile, Dwayne Wade has taken a visibly supportive role, often praised but also questioned by those who feel the visibility itself carries its own message. And that contrast, three different responses to similar situations, quietly complicates the idea that there's a single explanation tying it all together. But here's the detail that lingers a little longer than expected. When reactions vary this much, it becomes harder to argue that everyone is following the same script. And still, the influence of Katt Williams' perspective hangs in the background, not as a conclusion, but as a question mark that refuses to disappear completely. His theory suggests something coordinated, something intentional, but the reality unfolding on screen feels far more layered, shaped by personal choices, public pressure, and shifting cultural expectations all at once. So the deeper you go, the less this feels like a clear-cut answer, and the more it starts to resemble a reflection of fame, of identity, and of how quickly the rules can change. And maybe that's the part that keeps people watching, debating, and trying to make sense of it, because the story never quite lands in one place. It keeps moving, evolving, asking for interpretation without ever confirming it. Comment below with what you think is really going on. Leave a like if this gave you chills, and subscribe, plus turn on notifications if you want to see more Hollywood secrets